Welcome back to part 5. If you're new to the series, you do not need to have listened to the others to get something out of this, but it will give you significantly more context. And as additional context, this is not recorded in such a way that it is meant to be a polished final piece as one might expect from content creators these days. This is part of an action summary where I'm essentially doing an accountability project. I have, over the last 4.5 years, spent 5,800 hours on a project that is so complex. I'm currently creating a 250 plus page document workbook that is going to encompass tens of hours of time to complete. It is designed to explain a 5-phase model that begins phase 5 in 2050, essentially mapping out and scaling the next 25, soon to be 24 years of life. It encompasses centuries of planning, multi-generational cultural institutions, platforms, projects, systems, templates, workbooks, and so much more. Genuinely, it is a little bit of everything. And as you might imagine, that is far too much for one person to do on their own, and I agree. Which is why another project is the Human Collective, an individualized collective of self-actualized human beings. Essentially, collective identity without herd mentality. The benefit of the Asian model without the downside of the Asian model. And vice versa. No, the same statement from different orientation for the Western model. Everything has their perks, everything has their flaws, and if we've learned anything is that everyone and everything sucks. If you have a favorite politician, they suck. If, in some way, if you have a favorite country, your country sucks. My country sucks. We have that in common. Basically, everything sucks, because if it didn't, it wouldn't be powerful. And if it's powerful, then it's having an impact on your life. And so my goal is to try to make a system that helps us all suck just a little less. Unless sucking is your thing, in which case, suck all you want. I'm in favor of you having the right to suck. I know, I'm open-minded like that. But essentially, this video is not going to be super polished. It can go on as long or as short as it needs to be. We'll see where we go. However, my intentions with this are to very briefly, and if you look at I don't know how long this video is going to be, but if you look down and you see the timestamp, you might find that statement funny, until I remind you that I'm having to design a 250 page plus document to explain what I want to do with the next 25 years of my life in order to then be able to have an impact on our species development for the next 1,000, with considerations for the next literal 1 trillion years of potential life development that I call the human era scale. Plans within plans within plans, essentially. And in order to do that, in the previous version, in part 5, in part 3, was it? Yes. In part 3, where I was going over the phases, I explained what phase 2, 3, 4... No, I didn't really explain 3 and 4. But I did partly hint at what 5 could be, and I'm going to get a little bit more into it now, because phase 5 is actually intrinsically linked to many of these systems and projects and subsystems that are going to be covered today. There would need to be 3 to 7 to 12 hours of continuous discourse for you to get updated on 50% of the projects that I have in mind. Not just listing them, because I could list them all in X amount of time, but it's more explaining how they interconnect to one another in a multi-phase model. In fact, I couldn't get it to work. AI is just not there right now, but I essentially took the list of all the projects that I have, or most of them, and I fed it into AI to try and see how it could explain visually the branch of the pathways and projects. Let's go here. Activate this. Okay, so basically, if I go to... This was my first attempt, and it's not exactly right. It's close, like some of the... it's good enough. So it kind of gives you an understanding of some of the projects, though it butchers the spelling. It's like, at one point it just goes German, or Trusbrand. It's like Suck series. I have no idea what that's supposed to be. Book series instead of Suck series. Muthlamens. I don't know if you can read this, but like, look at that. I don't know what language this is, but Global Rulut. So essentially, multiple projects in my best attempt at creating a sort of visualized timeline. But this clearly was not very good, so I worked hard to try and make this second version, and even then it wasn't necessarily all that better. If I go like this. So basically in phase 2, phase 3, 4, and 5, different initiatives, how they tie to one another, but even then I started editing boxes in the middle, and then I realized this software is not made for this. I would, like, even here it starts wording things incredibly strange. So this, even now, is a very small amount of the projects that I've planned. So we can stop this, but essentially the goal behind these projects are relatively simple. The purpose is to demonstrate and explain what is going to be happening over the next X amount of years. The projects that I'm building, the systems that are in place, are designed to optimize for function, take the measure of any given system, find ways of literally creating accountability structures for the world of politics or education or health or lifespan. And different projects have different timelines, have different priorities and categories and financial estimates. And I cover this in, I believe, video 3, part 3, yes. Yes, in part 3 I cover this. But essentially at the midpoint of one of my documents, I essentially just have a bunch of different archived template notes, rubrics, ways of defining and categorizing different states. And just as I go, different organizational structures, different targets and templates, ways of understanding and mapping out what the next X amount of time will look like, whether that's 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 15 years, 25 years, 35 years, 50 years, 75. Then I don't think I did 90, but I'd go to 100, then 125, 150, 200, 250. And the end goal, essentially, is one of my projects is to live to 250. And in order to do that, longevity research and tech needs to be a little more advanced. So I'm currently the Montreal representative and Don't Die host for Montreal. And that Don't Die is Brian Johnson's global longevity initiative. I'm also the co-founder of Q2, a community infrastructure network that is currently being adapted to Q2 lifespan, so quantity and quality of lifespan, or quantity and quality of education. And the Q2 umbrella will be vast, but essentially right now we are designing an infrastructure model that will help centralize information, customize individual access to sub-communities, infrastructure, and essentially make the software that we are frustrated currently doesn't exist. And my personal goal is to kind of do something similar with everything. As an example, one of the projects I'm currently working on, within the end of the year, we're estimating having this either available as a product or very nearly TRIP. So I'm not going to be showing you the inside, but it essentially is a therapy protocol, or it is a TRIP integration protocol for psychedelics. So, for example, I have different templates, psilocybin, MDMA, things like that, and we're going to be turning this into a clinical software tool so that clinics can use it to guide patients through therapy or through the process. I also want to make this into an individual version, the way that I use it for recreational / self-therapy, self-healing routes. This is also part of 3 other projects. Plans within plans within plans. Plans within plans within plans. And so the idea behind all of this is relatively complex, but there are currently dozens of systems. Another one, for example, is care. So this is a model that I made to help me understand, was I taking care of my cat, my companion, little Fluffy over there? And essentially, for example, this is what it looks like on the inside. It's current. This is the most updated model, and it allows me to literally scale an understanding of, okay, on this day I want to do what? These are the things I want to do in a month. These are different forms of checklists, and at the end of the month, out of 25, have I taken care of my dependent? This eventually I want to also modify so that it applies to children or to individuals with disabilities like autism or some other forms. But essentially it is companionship and responsibility exemplified. It can be for any dependents. It could also be for yourself, care of self. That's another version that I want to make. What else? Oh yeah, I've also started working on SMART goals. So SMART goals, specific, I invented my own smart goals, where I added routines and I played around a little bit with the formulas. So basically making a different workbook that essentially creates an interactive guide to you understanding everything that you are. It's an older project from 2024, and I'm currently working on updating it. What else? There's actually so many. Ooh. This is one that I've made to track the state of my function and my fitness. So for those not in the know, I have a physical condition that it essentially kind of deteriorates my body. It's nothing drastic, but because I didn't manage it and because I had an injury that I didn't do physio for, it got worse. But essentially I'm hypermobile, and so I'm very flexible in certain parts of my body, and it has made it so that I need a lot more muscle to keep my joints in place, and without them I'm essentially very sensitive. And right now, without exaggeration, every single joint that I can detect in my body is either slightly vulnerable or actually damaged and in pain. For example, both of my wrists, both of my knees, and my lower back are in a state of physical dysfunction and pain, which is not ideal. However, understanding that my goal was function. I found myself in a state of disability. I broke my femur when I was, I want to say, 16, and I used the power of youth to kind of not do my physio, and I regretted that later on. I ended up having a series of issues. I lost a lot of muscle mass from that accident. Then I kind of just stopped doing sports. I went from a lot to basically zero. I started gaining discomfort and pain to the point where at one point I had to quit a job practically because I couldn't walk the stairs, and I was in a state of disability. And so I custom designed a fitness program where it essentially measures off of function, and it allowed me to chart my progression from dysfunctionality all the way to my goal, super functionality, at the end of a decade. And like everything that I do, it is an acronym. In fact, it's a backronym, a backwards engineered acronym. And it stands for Functionally Incremental Training Necessitating Exercise and Strengthening Systems. And if you want to take a look at the workout that I did yesterday, it looks something like this. So basically every day has a different program, and I have structured the entire series of it. Then there's also a back page where I can go over the evaluation. The reason it's still on this pad and not in my binder is because I haven't completed it. But essentially, I also can do a physical evaluation of my body to visualize where are the current states of pain and discomfort, and different body systems, just to keep a general understanding of what I'm about. The idea behind me showing you this and the care document and the trip document are, I attempted to figure out how the state of my function operated. I wanted to fix my body, and in so doing, I designed a system. This is what I'm essentially proposing that I can do for anything. One of my projects is to design a desk. Actually. At a certain point, when you have 17 journals, you start losing track. It wouldn't be journal 4. 3.5 maybe? Maybe 3.5. No, so this is 3 version 2 because I lost the binder at some point. And I made a new one, then I found it later. So I just did 3 and then 3 version 2. But if would it be here or the other one? Because essentially I started designing prototypes for a bunch of things. One of the projects that I have is to design a desk Ooh, that's a cat tree. No, so not a desk. That's different cat tree design. Okay, you'll just have to take my word for it. But essentially, I've been designing a lot of systems, a lot of projects, a lot of things. I'm also designing I want to build a home. So actually, one of the companies, or at least one of the projects that I want to scale and build is what is essentially the closest thing that Lego has to real life for infrastructure and infrastructure development. Interactive modular building that would allow you to scale infrastructure to a ridiculous degree and actually make it so that you could more or less custom design your inner architecture. Dismantling, like renovating your kitchen would be incredibly simple. Building a new building would be incredibly simple. Taking it down would be incredibly simple. Changing the color of your walls, incredibly simple. Moving infrastructure, updating things. Again, too many projects. We are not going to be here for 12 hours. I cannot get into the minute structure of thousands of hours of thought and reflection and note-taking in a single, God knows however long this video becomes. So the idea behind me showing you some of this is to indicate that there are many projects, project within projects, within projects, within projects, plans within plans within plans. And because there's such an overwhelming amount of plans, I genuinely cannot fit them all into a very simple basic presentation. There's too much information. So in fact, for the very first time in this so far 4-part series, I'm going to be showing a Word document, the currently fleshed out version of this workbook. So I'll open the Word document, uncollapse the ribbon. Oh, no, that's not what I want to do. Uncollapse the ribbon, then modify the formatting of the page layout, then adding it to more than one page per view, multiple pages. All right. So now, going back here. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. There we go. Hey. Beautiful. Okay, so essentially this is version 0.00.007. We can zoom in on it just to have a log. But essentially, the idea behind this is relatively simple. It's a workbook that was originally designed to take 10 hours, and by filling it out, you essentially come to understand a bit of who you are and what you want to do. So as an example, it helps you identify your identity, your motivations, your principles, and it kind of just continues. Then you start defining your terms, your actions, your state. Is it regenerative, degenerative? Then rubrics to understand how to classify it, a list of all the factors and projects and systems, and a way to account for whether or not it's useful in your life. Then an analysis, a deeper analysis of the individual factors to help you understand whether or not they are actually serving your needs. Then a list of all your projects, other considerations. And ultimately it looks something like this. We'll give it a second to load. As you can see, some of it is essentially empty pages because they're meant to be fleshed out and further developed, but then a lot of it is also just literally data and text and forms. And the section at the bottom here, these are essentially empty slots for me to then put in projects, for me to fill in the blanks, if you will. And then it continues below it, more projects, more systems, more formulas, more templates. That's a book so this over here is a book that I'm starting to write. Just basically a little bit of everything. And the idea of me showing you this is to demonstrate that there's a lot more to this than I can realistically communicate. And this document is designed to help me explain just that. So let's see if I can find a place where I might have... No, it's probably not here. Would it be maybe here? The path, final synthesis, no. Where would be the plans? There's a place where I list all of the projects. Oh, that might be below, actually. Ah. Would it be here? Huh. Okay, I'm genuinely a little confused because I thought it would be at the end. Okay, so then these are this Appendix C. What the hell? Okay, that's honestly very strange. I would have thought maybe if we open, no. It would be in view, it would be in navigation pane, and then on the side, project blueprints master set. Oh yeah, so basically this would be a place where I list all the projects, but then there should be a literal list. Okay, so these are summarized, broken down versions that I'm going to be templating and scaling out. Everything after section 6 isn't really fleshed out too much, but essentially my goal is to go and expand on these individual projects. So all of this essentially are just different projects, different systems, different ambitions, and then there's a bunch that I just left off, so I put a template that I could go and fill in. And over time, I'll be fleshing this out a lot more, but suffice it to say, plans within plans within plans. And so I have dedicated literally the rest of my life to this project, to this initiative. And the goal is relatively simple. It is to archive as much as I can, while compiling it into a single archived system that is accessible to most people with infrastructure that is built in to optimize for not only human comprehension and performance, but also for an ethical consumption of what we'll call economic investment. So for example, right now, as with any model, whether economic or political, it is inherently self-deregulating. All models are. And if we look at the current capitalist model, and I want to be clear, I'm not an anti-capitalist, just like I'm not an anti-communist. But all systems, if applied with no or virtually no guardrails, eventually auto-deregulate. And given enough time, literally all of them will. It is just a fact of anything existing that eventually it won't. The problem becomes that capitalism was relatively self-sustaining when you did not have the internet, when you didn't have the ability to communicate over vast distances, when you couldn't really run an empire from another continent, when you had genuine powers that could be decentralized, when you didn't have the ability to literally spy on every person everywhere at every time, when you couldn't fully control the transfer of information or the routines or the cultural practices and the beliefs, when you couldn't control the common meeting places or not as much, and when you did, you often had revolts. Now with technology, it's getting easier to control and have no accountability for it. It's becoming easier to remain completely, unquestionably unaccountable to people. And that is not good for us as a species. It's terrible. And yet, because it is also the case, we're seeing an ever-increasing amount of centralization and consolidation of resources. Capitalism is growing cancerous, and it is entering late stage. Late-stage capitalism has become necrotic, and it is going to consume us all, because the philosophy is exponential growth in a finite system. There are only so many people to exploit. There's only so many slaves overseas to which we can outsource our raw materials. There's only so many qualities of materials that we can degrade to before we start having products that don't work. There's only so many iterations we can make when everyone has a phone. How do you make them buy it again? Well, you start sabotaging the battery, you start sabotaging the processor, you start creating this incentive to constantly get back into the cycle. An exponential economic framework in a finite system simply does not work. It is not sustainable. Now, like I said, nothing is. But there's a difference between it will consume itself within a generation and if you're not careful, it can consume itself within 2 or 3 or 7 or 10 or 25. That is a very different dynamic. But unregulated self-market capitalism that is consuming itself alive is not going to work. Because what happens when capitalism wins? What happens when all the money is owned by 1 or 2 corporations? What happens when the people who buy the products don't have any more money to buy the products? Well, then you move away from capitalism and you go back to oligarchy, which is not necessarily in the optimal direction, in my point of view. So, in order to ensure that our species has what I consider to be a regenerative timeline, essentially aligning our species and its future with a regenerative potential, as in, if applied exponentially, it leads to a regenerative positive future instead of states of degeneration and backtracking on progress that we made in ethics and suffering. There's so much unnecessary suffering right now, and it's insane. We've had the ability to stop hunger for decades. And even right now, I believe the last estimate was it would take about 10 years of $100 billion per year to essentially end global hunger. That's less money than most major countries use in either 1 year or several. And if we organized ourselves, we could do that. And even if we don't do $100 billion per year, if we just do 10 and it takes us 15 or 20 years instead, we have had the ability to solve global hunger for over 40 or 50 years. And yet we haven't, because the people in charge don't want things to get better. And that is unfortunate, and it is also unfortunately true. We need to be very careful. We need to be very careful, because the world that we're heading for is going to become ever more complex in its technological infrastructure and the means of control that are available to the people who are in control. And those people are not you, and they are not I. And that's a bad thing, because the people in charge are not accountable nor representative of the people. And that has to change. Because by the time we get to the world's first trillionaire, we're going to be setting ourselves onto a path that is going to be so difficult to tilt. And for reasons that I'm not going to explain here, how we spend the next 1,000 years of our species will go on to impact how we do the next trillion. And I know that for some people that might not be important, but I think of everything that I can, to the extent that I can. And this is for another video, but the Millennium Initiative is a very small beginning to a 1 trillion+ years of multi-galactical civilizational development. For example, a very brief tidbit. We have approximately 1-ish billion years to escape the solar system before the sun, Sol, makes life on this Earth unpleasant. We have 4.3 billion years to prepare for what I'm calling the Andromeda calamity, because essentially the Andromeda galaxy in 4-ish billion years is going to start merging with the Milky Way, and that is going to be a 75 to 150 year billion process, jettisoning most gravitational orbits, destroying entire lanes of economic infrastructure and planetary development. But then there's also the added considerations of my version of the Drake equation, which by my estimate has maybe up to 10 galactic competitors, other alien civilizations in our galaxy. And the Andromeda galaxy, being about 2.5 times bigger, could have as many as 20 or 30 or maybe even 40. And over the span of multiple billions of years, humans and other alien species will diverge. There's a chance that at least one of any species in either galaxy develops a form of rogue AI that kills the living creators and becomes this self-replicating plague, where then if it happens in our galaxy, we essentially might have a mechanical plague heading for us in several 100 million years, and we don't know it. And that means that we kind of have to also, get our shit together faster rather than later. What happens if we have a catastrophe? What happens if the sun has a solar flare and knocks out half the world's infrastructure? What happens if we go back into the Dark Ages? What happens if we essentially deplete all the natural resources we have in the Earth, and then we get reset technologically and we don't have the raw material to go through another industrial revolution? What happens if an asteroid hits our planet before we're a multiplanetary species? What happens if the AI plague happens in the Andromeda galaxy, and it has 4 billion years to completely terraform that entire galaxy, and then over like 100 billion years, a full homogenized blend of AI super cancer and our galaxy could literally put into peril everything. And I'm explaining this simply to show that plans within plans within plans. It's too much to explain. I would literally need I would need three-hour conversations to get you up to date to the basics, so that you would be able to understand the terms that I have, the projects that I have. This video will not be doing that. In fact, I have a responsibility that I need to go to sooner rather than later. I just want to check on something. And I just noticed that I have a little bit more time than I planned, but I still won't be abusing too much of it. The way that I see it is, the only thing of any importance is that we survive. Brian Johnson has a very interesting philosophy of don't die, and he calls this a Zeroth principle idea. I agree. And I have one of my own, humanism, the idea of essentially embracing the spectrum hue of humanity. And that is where the channel name comes in, it's where the branding comes from, and there's going to be many more things on the way. Human enterprises, the human initiative, it's all human-based. Man, etymologically, means person, hue person. So the spectrum hue of a diverse species and a diverse collective. By learning to embrace the full spectrum hue of our potential, we can reach a regenerative timeline for our species by creating a living philosophy that seeks to self-actualize an individual and make them pillars of their community, seeking to have 1% of any group anywhere at any time, give or take, part of that individualized collective. We can also create a sub-movement of shepherds for our species to guide it over millennia, creating what will eventually become a religion and unfortunately also a cult, but at least as of its inception, or so my desires for it, is more of a personal philosophy and an ideology. But post-mortem, it will become a cult. And that's outside of my control, to a point. Another project involves what would be essentially my resurrection by turning an archive of my consciousness into a resurgence of a bit of data. Sort of not the Morpheus. I'm very tired. I've been talking for a while. I've done all of these back to back, and oh my god, I really need to eat also. But essentially, it is the ship of Theseus experiment, where if you have a ship and then over many years it starts to wear down, you replace all the pieces, all the nails, all the cloth, even though it looks identical start to finish thousands of years later, is it still the same ship if not a single molecule on board was part of the original? That's up for you to decide. I personally believe that yes, depending on what you mean. And in fact, multiple different answers can be simultaneously true. To that end, I don't know what I'm going to need to archive my consciousness, so I'm trying to archive all of it. Thousands of hours of audio and video logs, dozens of journals, a literal list of all the drugs that I take and have been taking for multiple years, with date, substance, variant, dosage, and time. Like, multiple pages of just drugs and drugs and drugs. And by drugs, I include caffeine, I include acetaminophen, I include various medications or full-on drugs, psychedelics, cannabis. When I start doing other projects in the drug-related world, I also want to start experimenting with basically all drugs, heroin, cocaine, things of that nature, while documenting it with medical professionals on board, a team to document the experience, turning it into the essentially Drug Users Almanac, my revised edition, my personal version of it, a subsystem of the TRIP initiative, which is a lot more complex than just what I shared earlier, and also literally then making the video of me taking these substances fully available publicly online as an archive. Plans within plans within plans. I do not have the ability to communicate what I'm trying to do. The only way that I can do it is to show you, and that is going to require time, it's going to require money, it's going to require commitment, and that is on the way. So now my brain is reaching its limit. I'm a little tired, a little fried, and I will be going because I'm actually going to be swimming very soon. So on that note, thank you. This has been very interesting, and I'm looking forward to getting some rest. It has been a very long 4.5 years, and it's going to be an even longer 225 years, 223 years to meet my target. And to the extent that this is a promise that I can make, I intend to be fully accountable at every step of the way. I intend to show my work, to be accountable, to be honest and kind and true. One of my greatest values is to be 99.98% aligned with my integrity, as best defined by my current understanding of unconditional love. This is a promise, and one that I hold to greatly. Everything that I do is thought out, from the channel name to my name to the projects that I have to the systems that are going to execute on it. And that will come in time. This is an exponential framework. Slow at first, but exponential. Very soon, the compounding interest will surprise even me, which should go a very long way to explaining how much it should surprise you. So on that note, I will be off. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been interesting, and if you have a question, please do drop it in the comments. However, as I've said the last 2 or 3 of these recordings, I will also share the following. Don't like the video. Don't subscribe. Don't leave a comment. Not unless you actually want to. Because the algorithm is not your friend, nor is it mine. It is a tool. But it's also predatory, because it is designed by predatory people and systems. Do it if you want to. And don't do it if you don't. It won't change anything for me either way. But if you do decide to connect, if you do decide to get interested, if you are curious about something, I will answer your question. I will appreciate your support. And I am looking forward to catching you next time. Have a good day, a good evening, and or a good night. Take care.